Welcome everyone, people at the back, people at the front, and we've got quite a few people online as well. Just to say, to start with, we've got books. This is a book launch, and there's books for sale through Unity Books at the back. Make sure you get your copy. They're selling like hotcakes. So it's a great delight tonight to be launching this Fabian book, and it's a great delight to be hosting the two Maxes again, Max Rashbrook, Max Harris, both contributors to the fine Fabian's book, which I think has a brilliant name, whoever invented it, Privatisation and Plunder, Neoliberalism, Causes, Costs and Alternatives. And they're going to pick up some of the themes from the book in their short talks. After they've spoken, Mike Smith will be acknowledging the book contributors and Dick Weary for his backing. We'll finish the formal part by 6:15, 6:30, so that you can join us for a celebratory drink, sausage rolls, book buying, book signing by some of the writers who are here. But first of all, our two speakers. You don't need me to tell you that we've still got all the neoliberal principles embedded in New Zealand's legislation, in Treasury, in the minds of National and ACT Party MPs, and a number of Labour Party MPs too. And yet another neoliberal nail in our economic coffin, the Regulatory Standards Act was passed last week. So I've asked our speakers a bunch of questions. Are we seeing the last days of neoliberalism, or is it being turbocharged by this government, by Trump, by others? Second question, New Zealand governments of various stripes, both Labour and National, have merely played around the edges and seem to lack any coherent idea of alternatives to neoliberalism or the will to make substantive reforms. Will the next progressive government, which we're going to vote in later next year, do the major reforms in this and other key areas, or will they continue just to tweak the dials? What other countries can we look to as examples? And finally, the question many people are asking, does Mamdani's election in New York offer us hope? Just a few questions. Okay, Max Rashbrook comes from his launch last week of his brilliantly conceived Kids KiwiSaver. His think tank idea is incredibly productive, and Max continually nudges and pushes our thinking. Over to you, Max.
Well, good evening, everyone. Apologies for the delays and the issues around the audio setup, but one of the problems of popularity, I guess. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. Yes, and thank you to all of you in the back. It's lovely to be sharing rostrum again with Max Harris, and thank you very much to the Fabians. Thank you very much for everyone involved in the book. Thank you to the editors, to the publishers. It's always lovely to be doing things with Max, and because, as he recently revealed at a conference, we increasingly get confused with each other to the point where Max is starting getting mail that's destined for me. This is actually a good opportunity for us just to catch up on things and exchange mail and other important things like that. But all of that aside, obviously this is also a chance to discuss a very important topic, which, as Philip has said, is the role of neoliberalism in New Zealand history and New Zealand politics, its continuing influence on those structures and where it might be taking us in the future. And one of the questions that Philip asked us to consider for this event, which I think he's alluded to already, is the question of, is neoliberalism accelerating? Is it being intensified, or actually is it on its last legs? And I think Max H will fill this in more detail, but I very loosely take neoliberalism to mean core mechanisms like privatisation, deregulation, and reductions in taxation in the size of government, all in the service of a wider project, which is, in broad terms, to try to remake all of human life in the form of the market. So basically to try to turn everything into a series of individual transactions. If you take that as a rough kind of working definition, would you say around the world that neoliberalism is accelerating? I think the answer would be maybe, sort of, but not in any coherent sense. If you just look at Trump, for instance, yes, he has instituted yet another round of massive tax cuts which favour the wealthy. On the other hand, there is no corresponding commitment to try to reduce the size of government, at least in the short term. So what those tax cuts are going to do is massively blow out the US budget. In New Zealand, can you see examples of that neoliberal logic at work? Yes, you can, in things like the form of the Regulatory Standards Act. However, I would say there's a pretty pale shadow of the thing that ACT would have liked to get across the line. You also see things like, obviously there's regulation still being wound back in the regulations of building inspection, for instance, and health and safety. And you can also see movements like the introduction of greater elements of private provision in the health service. But again, I would say those are a pretty pale shadow of, say, the Gibbs report in the 1990s, which really wanted the health system run like a business. You know, these are pretty dim and distant echoes of a really full-throated neoliberalism, I think. The much bigger trend that we're faced with internationally at the moment is obviously authoritarian populism. Again, embodied in the shape of Trump, but also people like Orban in Hungary, Nigel Farage in the UK, and many others such. And now that authoritarian populism is in many senses not particularly neoliberal. Its sort of founding texts or kind of the intellectual apparatus around populism includes things like Patrick Deneen's critique of liberalism, where he argues that really liberalism has failed massively because it has created an atomized, individualized world, and it has led to the decline of community, to those shared ties and bonds, those networks that actually make life so fulfilling, that make communities functional. And so a lot of the critique of the world that populism proposes, to the extent that it has a coherent one, is actually against some of the atomization and the individualism that neoliberalism has wrought. And authoritarian populism is also very comfortable with the big state. So again, if you look at Trump, tariffs are absolutely not part of the neoliberal playbook. In fact, tariffs are to neoliberals what garlic is to vampires or kryptonite to Superman. You know, they really are anathema. Trump is also a pretty big fan of industrial policy in his own crude, awful way. You know, he's very comfortable with using government to reshape the economy, to bring more manufacturing onshore, to take government stakes in companies. And again, I think you can see those sorts of forces, I would say probably greater energy behind that in New Zealand, that kind of populism, than there is real sort of free market fundamentalism. You know, where ACT has been most vocal and most in the media, most obvious, has been around things like the Treaty Principles Bill. Thankfully failed, thankfully defeated. But you know, that is where a lot of I think the energy is. So we don't just live in a neoliberal world in any simple sense. I think, in fact, what we're living with is a world in which a base level of neoliberalism has had this authoritarian populism layered or bolted on top of it. And so it's very appropriate given what's in the cinemas at the moment. We live in a kind of Frankenstein world. We have this weird, awful hybrid of neoliberalism and authoritarian populism. So we definitely don't live in an exclusively neoliberal world. But we are absolutely dealing with its legacy, the legacy of neoliberalism, not least because that is in part what has given rise to that populism that we're now all faced with. There is now a huge volume of evidence that says that the single greatest early predictor, early warning sign about the decline of democracy and the slide into authoritarianism is a massive disparity between rich and poor. And of course, that's what a more market fundamentalist world gives you. And there is also very strong evidence that another and related predictor of the rise of authoritarian right-wing populism is economic insecurity. So it's not just that in this market fundamentalist world, a lot of people earn very low incomes, it's also that their lives are incredibly unstable, because markets have many great characteristics, but stability and predictability are not among them. The world of the market is the world of constant change, of constant competition, of no one ever having a sure place to rest at the end of the day. And so that inequality, that insecurity that neoliberalism has wrought has given rise directly to the authoritarian populism that we have to deal with. And so we need to see its impact in there as well. Now, of course, populism, authoritarian populism comes in and it pretends to pose some solutions to the problems created by liberalism or neoliberalism. Now, of course, those solutions, I hardly need to say, are deeply inadequate or sometimes completely false, or even worse than that, violent and coercive, and a massive threat to everyone's democratic rights, but also specifically to minority rights. So the solutions that we're being promised at the moment are false. Nonetheless, they do sound plausible, and that's why that energy, that populist energy, that authoritarian energy is on the rise in New Zealand to some extent, and very vividly and very worryingly across the world as a whole. How do we respond then to this world that we're in, this weird sort of Frankenstein monster of a political situation? Well, I think firstly and very obviously, we need a politics that takes material issues seriously, that takes seriously the problems caused by economic insecurity and economic precarity, a politics that is committed to tackling those issues and tackling them deeply. That in itself brings into play a whole range of issues. I think very often when we think about inequalities of income and wealth, we tend to think we go straight to questions of redistribution, of taxation and benefits. But all of that happens downstream from the inequalities that are created in workplaces, that are created in the market, what is sometimes clunkily called pre-distribution. And that's all about the power or the lack of power of trade unions. It's about the financialization of the economy. It's about the movement of capital around the world. It's about a change in the power balance in the workplace, which has been massively in favour of those who own businesses and massively against those who work in them. So we need a politics that takes those things seriously, that tackles inequality at source, as well as through the tax and benefit system, and as well as through fixing what is often quite a dysfunctional housing system. So we need solutions in those sorts of areas. More broadly, I think we also have to be able to defend values that are opposite to those of market fundamentalism. In particular, we need to revive and revitalise the idea of the common good. And that's something I'll be writing more about in the coming months and years. We also need to rebuild political movements because just talking about ideas can be somewhat disembodied. Actual change comes about through on-the-ground organising. But I also think we need to be really attentive to what might sound like a quite boring question, but which is about what works. And I say this because sometimes amongst people who care about the planet and who care about social justice and who care about rights, there is a view that what we haven't done sufficiently well is to articulate our values. We haven't sufficiently clearly articulated a vision of a better world. Now, I'm not wholly opposed to that idea, but I think that actually sometimes the values have been quite well articulated, and that actually sometimes the rest of the country agrees with us to quite a substantial extent. Often what they are unconvinced about is whether the vision of the world that we are advancing will actually work. And these kinds of questions are extremely influential, I think. They can sound quite dull and sort of mechanistic, but they are very influential in shaping how people think about the world and, frankly, how they vote. I've been very influenced by a number of focus groups that the Auckland academic Peter Skilling ran a number of years ago, where he was sort of talking deeply to a wide range of ordinary New Zealanders and just trying to understand how they think and feel about economic disparities. And Peter published a lot of his research in an article that I think was called Neoliberal Subjectivities and Individual Consolations. And what he found throughout running those focus groups is that because it's New Zealand, 9 out of 10 of the people in those focus groups were instinctive egalitarians. You know, they wanted a fairer world, they wanted a better world. But what happened was that people would express those ideas sort of often quite stumblingly and incoherently, and it would take just the one remaining person in the focus group, the one self-styled market realist, to stand up and say, look, that's all very well, but you can't change the market, you can't change the way that it works, you can't change the way that it allocates goods and incomes and services, and people would just crumble. You know, they didn't have anything to argue back against that. It wasn't really a values contest, it was just a contest about what does and doesn't work, and the idea that actually nothing else works. There is no alternative, a phrase that many of you will be very familiar with. And so Peter called his article Individual Consolations and Neoliberal Subjectivities because basically people not believing that there was any opportunity to do things differently retreated to individual consolations. They would say, well, the system may not be fair, but at least I've done well within it. That was their individual consolation. Another bit of evidence that's relevant here is from the work of the Scandinavian political scientist Bo Rothstein, who has pointed out that if you look at people who've got essentially very similar political views on questions of redistribution, two people who want, who have a similar desire for high levels of tax and high levels of redistribution, the people who believe that government is effective are much more likely to actually vote for that than the people who do not. So I think we have to take very seriously these questions about what does and doesn't work. Neoliberalism's promises are false, but it does have a clear account of how things can happen, why markets are effective, why they will deliver you a better world. And I don't think that we've been very often good at engaging with those arguments on those terms. And so what I wanted to close on is a point that will be familiar to you who've heard me talk about these things before, and it's very much the thrust of my contribution to the book. And my thinking here is very heavily influenced by a wonderful 1970 book by Albert Hirschman called Exit, Voice and Loyalty. And he sort of says, well, if you think about it, how do markets fundamentally improve things? Well, they do it through exit. Basically, people can exit the service, and the threat of doing that forces you to perform better. Choice is another way of putting it. Conversely, public bodies improve through voice, through listening to what citizens have to say and adjusting what they do as a result. And now, I think part of the problem of the world that we live in, part of the reason why often neoliberalism and market fundamentalist views still hold a remarkable amount of sway, is that markets are constantly updating and innovating and doing things better, and government, the public sector, has often stayed stuck in the 20th century. And so my very profound belief is that we need to quite seriously rethink the way public bodies work, public services work, the whole apparatus of the public realm works, so that at every moment it is much more deeply responsive to our voices, to our combined informed voices, than it is at present, where too often it's top-down, decisions taken by politicians, decisions sometimes taken by officials who are quite estranged, I would say, from their communities. So I think, and I talk much more about this in my chapter, creating forums where we can come together and collectively and democratically shape public service is crucial, both in of itself and for having an argument about how we can build a better world. Because I think often when we articulate our values, We are believed to a large extent by the wider public. But it's not just enough for people to believe you, they have to trust you. And trust is about, are you going to do the thing that you say you're going to do, and are you actually capable of doing it? So unless I think we can fight better on the territory of what works, we run the risk of often being believed, but not necessarily trusted. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Max. There's a lot to unpack there. Max Harris has been campaigning for free dental, and he writes a lot about importance of trade unions, bringing services back into public ownership, electricity sector, Ministry of Green Works, and I believe you do stand reasonably opposed to the neoliberal gospel. So over to you, Max.
Tēnā koe, Philip. Tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Max Harris tōku ingoa. He Pākehā hau, he tangata tiriti a hau. Ki a koe Max. Tēnā koe. Ki te mana whenua, ki ngā mana whenua, tēnei rohi, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I just want to start by paying tribute to Chris and Richard Weary and the work they've done on this excellent book. Someone sent me a text 3 weeks ago and said, congrats on the new book. And I said, I don't have a new book. And I want to be clear that all the hard work that has gone into this book has, I think, come from Chris and Richard Weary. The idea of it, the selection of articles, and the hard work in editing them and pulling the ideas together. And I think it's excellent on some important left concepts across a spectrum. So concepts like the precariat, concepts like rentier capitalism, concepts like MMT, but it also has New Zealand-specific analysis from people like Max Rashbrook, from Jeff Bertram, and it makes quite specific proposals that I think we can all talk about, like basic income or Ministry of Green Works or other ideas. So get a copy if you can. This is important work. I also want to say thank you to the Fabians. I think we need more institutions rather than individuals in progressive politics in New Zealand, and the Fabians is one example of a pan-left institution that hosts talks, that helps us to think harder, that helps us to get away from the socialism without doctrine, which is how Australia and New Zealand were once described, and to get us thinking about the undercurrents in our politics. So thanks to the Fabians, thanks to all of you for being here. Let's give them a round of applause. I'm going to talk about 3 questions. One, what is neoliberalism and is it dead yet? But I won't spend a whole lot of time on that. Secondly, how has New Zealand neoliberalism differed? And then thirdly, how do we overcome neoliberalism? And I guess the theme running through what I'm going to say is that there are New Zealand features of neoliberalism that we should map and understand in order to respond to neoliberalism in this place, but that we can and must overcome neoliberalism in this place. And that will come down to not just a better policy program or a really good long list of demands. It will come down to building capacities of people and building power. I'll just start with what neoliberalism is and whether it's dead yet. And I tried to piece together some thoughts on this back in 2018, and it was a bit sad for me looking at this and thinking that I tried to wrestle with this in 2018 and that we're in 2025 now. And I don't want to be writing about this or thinking about this in 2032, in 7 years' time. I want us to move beyond it. But I just want to draw a little bit on what I tried to piece together then. So in 1951, an essay came out called Neoliberalism and Its Prospects, and it was by Milton Friedman. And it said, neoliberalism was going to be about the importance of the individual, a competitive order, minimal interference in markets. And interestingly, Milton Friedman said, he considered it would take 20 years for there to be a change in the underlying current of opinion and the resultant alteration in public policy. But Friedman said he thought his new faith would fill the vacuum that seems to me to be developing in the beliefs of intellectual classes the world over. And I think it's interesting for 2 reasons. First of all, I think it's interesting that Milton Friedman himself used the word neoliberalism, because sometimes we're told often by the right that neoliberalism is just a word used by the left, just a loose word without analytical purchase. And this is a reminder that Friedman himself, as well as others, as well as Hayek and others, talked about neoliberalism. But secondly, I think his timeframes are interesting to come back to the year that we're in now. Because I think in about 2009, after the global financial crisis, there felt like the emergence of an intellectual vacuum around the economic and political system that we're in. And if Milton Friedman was right, and maybe he was wrong, but if he was right that it takes 20 years for there to be a change in the underlying current of opinion and the resultant alteration in public policy, then I think we have until 2029 to make sure that we build that alternative, which gives us not very long. And there's a need for a sense of urgency. I quite liked what Max said about what neoliberalism is, some core policy mechanisms in the service of redesigning life in the image of the market or similar. Just briefly, and so maybe you have some ammo to respond to someone who says, well, what is neoliberalism really, and isn't that concept meaningless? I think there are 6 ways of understanding neoliberalism. I think first, as a philosophy of government, as an order of government, especially focused on reducing and dismantling the social state and the role of the government in the economy to serve certain social interests. Second, and I can elaborate on these later if it's helpful, but second, I do think it can be a policy package, which has been common around the world, and Max has mentioned this, many of you will be familiar with this. Deregulation, the loosening of rules around markets, privatisation, the offloading of public assets, the weakening of trade unions, the reordering of the tax system, reintroducing more regressive taxes like GST in this country, or introducing regressive taxes like GST and reducing the progressivity of the tax system, the corporatisation of the public service, inflation targeting, the removal of industrial policy, and also I would add an important carceral dimension where in many countries where neoliberal policies have come in, we've seen an explosion in the prison population. And one explanation of that is that those who fall outside of the discipline of the market and the discipline of that new faith that Milton Friedman referred to have been punished more harshly as an attempt to entrench that order. So that's the policy package. I think it can also be seen as a class project, as an attempt to elevate the power and wealth of the ruling class. That's the third way of understanding it. I think it can be understood as a new political language, fourth. So Wendy Brown is someone who's written a lot about this. The move to talking about human capital, for example, or consumers and clients rather than citizens. Fifth, it can be understood as a project to define the limits of the political world. So Mark Fisher, I think, responding to this policy package, has written about capitalist realism, the notion that certain things become impossible under capitalism and under neoliberal capitalism in particular, that it's harder to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world. And sixth, I think it can be understood as a social engineering project or an attempt to shift values. And we should remember that Margaret Thatcher talked about the need, economics being the method and the object being to change the heart and soul. And there are people in New Zealand who've talked about the kinds of soul that has grown in the shadow of neoliberalism. The kind of soul that means, for example, that if you look at loneliness statistics kept by Statistics New Zealand, the loneliest group in New Zealand is young people. It's 15 to 24-year-olds. It's not older people. There's more that I could say about what neoliberalism is. I think, as someone that works in law, that the role of lawyers and lawyer economists in neoliberalism has been understated. And it's worth remembering that Hayek and Richard Epstein and other key neoliberal figures studied and trained in law. But on the question of whether it's dead yet, just to add to what Max said, my view is that it's very much alive and evolving in a new form, and I agree with a lot of what Max said. I think one important point to understand here is that neoliberalism, in my view, was never about a smaller state. And we see that in the fact that in many countries with what we might call neoliberal policies, there was an expansion in the prison state and in the defence state. So that's true in the UK, that's true in New Zealand. And I think we're better off seeing neoliberalism as a change in orientation in the interests served by the state and a move to entrench the interests of the wealthy and the powerful and the ruling class. And if you want to read more about that, there's a particularly good piece by Mary Robertson called Left Economics from Below, where she teases out this idea. And I think it's really important because often we have people on the right, including under the current government, saying, oh, well, look at the government increasing its public debt. Doesn't this show that this government isn't a neoliberal government? And I think if we have a more interest-sensitive, class-sensitive understanding of neoliberalism, we have at least a starting response to that. That does, though, raise the question, if neoliberalism is just about class interests, how is it different from capitalism? And I want to leave that question in the air. John Quiggin in this book calls neoliberalism the dominant ideology of capitalism, so the sort of narrative that goes with the recent form of capitalism. And there's been a really interesting debate for those of you that want to read more in the New Left Review, in particular with the work of Dylan Riley and Robert Brenner, arguing that we have a new form of political capitalism and that we have this long downturn since the 1970s. But I just want to leave that question about how useful it is as a term and whether we should just get back to talking about capitalism. But let me come to Aotearoa New Zealand, and I will come to how we can overcome this and being a bit more positive in a moment. But I want to pause on how neoliberalism has differed in New Zealand. And I want to draw on my experience working in the UK, working in economic policy in the UK, and working in advocacy in the UK, and compare New Zealand and the UK. The first point I'd make is that, in my view, one, if not unique feature about New Zealand neoliberalism, then at least a dominant feature is that New Zealand neoliberalism is locked into legislation, and that hasn't happened everywhere. So in New Zealand, we have features of what I've described as neoliberalism in our Public Finance Act, or gestured towards at least, in the Public Finance Act. For example, the reference to prudent public debt. We also have it in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, now part of the Public Finance Act. And this is important in New Zealand in particular, and here I want to put on my legal hat for a moment, but in a way that is hopefully accessible to non-lawyers, because we don't have a single written constitution, and I think there is a good argument that we have a neoliberal constitution that was entrenched in the 80s and 90s. And this is a point that's been made by Jane Kelsey and others. The point in outline is that if we have a political constitution where landmark political achievements contribute to the constitution we have, rather than one single written constitution, then certain landmark political achievements like the Public Finance Act, like the Fiscal Responsibility Act, can have constitutional and higher level force. And I think those acts have been built up through advocacy, through think tanks, and through consistent media work to give the status of higher norms to norms like low public debt, and to other features of the neoliberal order. So that's the first point, is it's locked into legislation and that changes what we should do. Second point about New Zealand neoliberalism is I do think it is rolling on in a different way from the UK. So I think in the UK in particular, the Conservative Party has shifted its rhetoric. I'm not sure it's no longer a neoliberal party, but it has become much more open to industrial policy, for example. So there was a Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy set up under Theresa May's government. And in this country, I don't think we see the National Party, to the same extent at least, shifting its rhetoric. And we, of course, have the Regulatory Standards Act as one piece of unfinished neoliberal business, which again is locking in a process of encouraging deregulation and processes of deregulation, even if it may not have gone as far as the ACT Party would have liked. Third point about New Zealand neoliberalism is I think it's striking, and I know these are relatively impressionistic judgments, but it's striking to me how leading neoliberal figures and organisations remain central in New Zealand life compared to leading neoliberal figures and organisations in the UK. And we could spend more time on this, but I think examples here include Richard Prebble, with a regular column in the New Zealand Herald, Ruth Richardson, now chair of the Taxpayers Union, the Business Roundtable, still rolling on in the form of the New Zealand Initiative, I think much less marginalised than some key figures and organisations in the UK. I also think that in New Zealand, there's a particular amnesia about pre-1980s policy. And again, this is impressionistic, but I think perhaps stronger traditions of class consciousness in the UK mean that there are regular conversations and public discussions about 20th century social democratic achievements and a certain treasuring of the NHS. In contrast, I think in this country, there are many institutions that if you were born in the 1980s, you might not know once existed, like the Development Finance Corporation or the Ministry of Works. And I say that because I was born in 1988 and didn't know those things existed until far too late in my life. So how do we overcome neoliberalism? How do we respond to it? If neoliberalism has had a particular New Zealand character, and I want to say that our target shouldn't only be neoliberalism. Maybe I'll make one just passing comment on Max's really interesting remarks about authoritarian populism, because I agree that that's a problem globally, but I don't think it's as disconnected from neoliberalism perhaps as what Max was suggesting. I do think that neoliberal capitalism in the last 40 to 50 years has created the conditions under which authoritarian populism has been allowed to rise. I also think the racist far right and the neoliberal right are far more connected in origins and in approach than is often acknowledged. And Quinn Slobodian's work, including on figures like Elon Musk and on figures like Peter Thiel coming out of apartheid South Africa, are good examples of this, but you also just need to look at some of the Business Roundtable's early work on Te Tiriti o Waitangi and its racist references to Māori as an animist culture, to, in my view, to demonstrate that these strands of the right have been woven together and are not so far apart. So how do we overcome neoliberalism? I'll try to be a bit more uplifting now, and I'll try to leave you with something to take away, and perhaps at the risk of being a little less analytical. But generally, I think of the world in materialist terms. So I think the economy is fundamental, but I think in this country, the economy is tangled up in colonization and in racism, and I think that affects how we need to analyze it, but that means the economy is central to moving beyond neoliberalism. I'm going to suggest that there are 6 aspects of overcoming neoliberalism, 6 R's, and that's hopefully the part that is easy to remember. The first R is remembering, the second is reprogramming, the third is rebelling, fourth is rebuilding, fifth is renewing faith, and the sixth is remobilizing. And let me say a bit about each of those, and I'll end with Mamdani on a high note. I think we need to remember the institutions that predated neoliberalism, not because they were perfect, but because we can learn the lessons of those institutions, and they demonstrate that there is an alternative. So for example, the Development Finance Corporation, which is the subject of very few studies, is an example of a national development bank that used some of the same tools that economists like Ha-Joon Chang praise in South Korea. So Ha-Joon Chang has written a lot about export targets tied to particular social and economic, he's talked a lot about funding tied to certain economic goals like export targets and how important that tool was in South Korea. The Development Finance Corporation used suspensory loans, very much the same tool. I'm not suggesting it needs to be reproduced in its exact form, but there is a lot to learn from it. Similarly, the Ministry of Works did huge hurt and damage and was responsible for the theft and removal of Māori land, but it also built many of the things in this city and in this country that we appreciate today, or had a role in building, including, for example, a lot of the buildings around Parliament and the old law school building, and that's explained more in the Ministry of Green Works report and chapter in this book. So I think we need to remember to start with, and that includes remembering the full history of this country, as well, including Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Secondly, I think it's important that we reprogram, and by that I mean unwinding some of those laws that have locked in neoliberal ways of thinking in the public sector and in the public. And Jeff Bertram talks about this in his chapter in his book, but that means squaring up to the Public Finance Act, but also looking at more recent laws like the Employment Relations Act, which is still, in my view, very much influenced by the Employment Contracts Act and still needs to be unwound and rethought. Third, just moving through these quite quickly, when I say rebel, I think we need to be rebelling against the neoliberal maneuvers towards privatisation and austerity. And I do think just watching these maneuvers, we can catalogue some certain tried and true tactics. So claims, for example, of ineptitude in the management of Te Whatu Ora and Health New Zealand to justify vicious cuts. Claims of irregular excessive spending by disabled carers to justify hurtful and hugely painful disability cuts in early 2024. Manoeuvres around impending debt crises, which we hear about in Auckland to justify the sale of the Auckland airport shares, or we hear about more generally, which, as is noted in this book, Roger Douglas acknowledges was a poor argument to justify privatisation. So there are 3 I's to go with the 6 R's to think about the kind of manoeuvres of neoliberalism that we need to rebel against. And what that means is engaging with economics, not being scared of numbers, and pushing back when we have a sense of crisis whipped up around public debt or around some of these common tactics of the right. So that's the 3rd thing we need to do. The 4th thing is I do think we need to rebuild, and that requires bold, courageous politicians who believe in the state. And that means reclaiming public ownership, for example. Public ownership of energy is something that the Council of Trade Unions has proposed. It means reclaiming public infrastructure, for example, through a Ministry of Green Works. It means reclaiming local and public delivery of services through insourcing or ending outsourcing. That requires policy work, and it requires politicians who can stand up to interests who would threaten the sky falling in the event of public ownership or public infrastructure at a local or central level. And it requires all of us pushing back when we hear other people in conversation talking about this. And often it requires going back to the sources of documents that people claim show eye-watering levels of public debt or ineptitude, because often these claims are not borne out by closer inspection. We need to renew faith in a social and economic state. That was my 5th R. And that means believing in the state again and believing in rebuilding state capacity, which has been hollowed out, as you know, in this city. And there are people that have done good work on that, including Toby Moore in and out of Parliament, and including people in this book who talk about the need to push back on stories about public debt. For example, there are discussions about MMT, and even if you're not an MMTer, I think you can acknowledge that MMT has opened up space for further conversations about public debt. But finally, and most importantly, I think we have to remobilise. And the reason for that is that the great Achilles heel of neoliberalism is that it's not popular. A constituency has been built up in favour of privatisation, but I don't believe, and this is borne out by polling, I think we have someone here from Talbot Mills tonight, but it's borne out by polling that you can see done on public ownership and on free public services, that the public supports universal public services. So 74% of people in recent polling support universal free dental. 73% support universal public transport. There are similar majorities in favour of public ownership. That public needs to be mobilised, and that does mean tapping into values and tapping into anger, because what has occurred, as the title of this book indicates, is plunder, is the extraction of resources from workers and from public services leaked away into shareholder dividends. And only through mobilising the public and the full public will we be able to move beyond neoliberalism. And when I say the full public, I say that deliberately because in this country, I share Bruce Jesson's view that the solidarity between non-Māori and Māori is one of the most important things for building a progressive future in this country. And that's for many reasons. That's because it's because it's a constitutional obligation on all of us, with Te Tiriti as a founding constitutional document. It's because, as I saw in a recent Dental for All roadshow, and without romanticising, there is enormous collective energy and relational capacity in Māori communities that the rest of us have to catch up on. And it is because, as we've seen in recent times, there are exciting visions of tino rangatiratanga, exciting visions like Mateke Mai, which will motivate people to take to the streets to fight back against what is dominant at the moment. Very lastly, what can we take from Mamdani? In my view, Mamdani shows many things that a universalist and an anti-racist and anti-colonial agenda can go together, that we can call for excellence in public services and retain and attract popular support, and that a genial and positive and bold democratic socialist can win elections and will continue to win elections. The very final thing I'll say is recently I read a piece by Greg Gonsalves, who's a public health campaigner, and he was talking about the public health movement moving beyond its circles. And his message was, we all have to be campaigners. And I think that applies not just to public health, but to many people in this room. He said we need to see ourselves once again as campaigners above all, and to join forces with the social movements of the day. And it's only through doing that that we can remember, reprogram, rebel, rebuild, renew, and remobilize to build a better future. Thank you.
Thanks so much to our two speakers. They've been two brilliant talks and a call to action as we move into election year 2026. These talks were live streaming, and they'll be available subsequently online, and I think we're going to have to transcribe them and publish them. The publishing venture will go on. But could you join me now in thanking both our speakers for two tremendous talks? I'm going to hand over now to Mike Smith to talk briefly about the book, and then we'll break for refreshments.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Mike Smith, tōku ingoa. Am I getting feedback? No. On behalf of the New Zealand Fabian Society, it is my pleasant duty to offer our very great thanks to Dick Wherry at the launch of this book titled Privatisation and Plunder, Neoliberalism, Causes, Costs and Alternatives. The book is very much Dick's baby. From his original insistence that we must publish our presentations, through to his persistence in all the many tasks over several years that have gone into the final volume, which is set on its way today. As the subtitle says, the book tracks Aotearoa's neoliberal history, provides an analysis, and offers some alternatives going forward. Dick has also written the foreword that lays bare the ideology that has underpinned our experience of New Zealand's decline over the last 40 years. He has been ably assisted by his son, Chris Wherry, Emeritus Professor of Rhetoric at University of California, San Diego. We're also very grateful to all those brilliant public intellectuals who have allowed their present Fabian presentations to form the body of the book. The book's title was chosen very deliberately. Privatisation has seen New Zealand's public wealth plundered. One of Dick's favourite words, quietly uttered, is outrageous, and that is the truth of it. Politicians have enabled it, corporations and influential insiders have profited mightily from it, and officials have promoted it. I well remember finding a typed draft copy of the Treasury's book that launched at Economic Management on the Labour Party photocopier the Monday after the 1984 election. The Fabian Society's motto is to incite debate, and there is no more important debate than how to restore a more equal society after the neoliberal wreckage. I would just like to draw attention to my friend Guy Standing's contribution. He has also written about plunder in his books, The Plunder of the Commons and The Blue Commons, which was the plunder of the sea. Guy's most famous insight has been to identify the precarious as the revolutionary class, to add another R to Max's 6, from whom this restoration is most like to come. In Aotearoa New Zealand, the precariat now reaches into all levels of society and is present in so many, very many of the young. I'm delighted to say there are increasing signs of new thinking and new energy, as we have heard here tonight, to build a better future. The Fabians will do our best to assist with this process of necessary change. Once again, our greatest thanks to Dick and Chris, to Roger Steele of Steele Roberts, and to all the authors of what is a great read and will be a great resource. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou.